There are a lot of different ways that anyone could be good at Geometry Dash, whether you slowly work your way up to harder and harder levels, or jumping towards the hardest levels immediately. Everyone has their methods of improving, and from every player starting off as noobs to a few rapidly becoming the best, today we'll be looking at the history of Geometry Dash's top players. I hope you all enjoy. Now, the term top player has a couple different meanings, whether it is someone who has the most skill in the game, or someone who completed a crazy amount of levels that are the most difficult, hence the release of the Demon List. So what originally started this trend of thriving at the top? Well, let's begin the journey. Back in 2014, the thought of competitively beating the hardest demons wasn't as big of an interest compared to every other year, but it didn't mean that there weren't some good players at the time. A few names that popped up were Andromeda, Neptune, and Alex Payne 24. At the time, these three players were completing and creating a few very difficult levels, a couple of which being Necropolis and the Ultimate Phase. The amount of skill required to beat these levels back in 2014 was unbelievable, which, funnily enough, was actually unbelievable, because later on, Andromeda and Neptune had been exposed for cheating, which made Alex Payne one of the main legitimate icons in Geometry Dash. But over time, the community started growing more and more, which increased the competitiveness in the game, and with that, we move on to the next year. 2015 may have been the most important year for Geometry Dash, as this was when top players such as Riot and Cyclic rose to the top in a historic back and forth battle. Riot was responsible for verifying one of the most famous levels in Geometry Dash history, Bloodbath, and during his journey to beat it, Cyclic wanted to show everyone who was the better player, so he created Sonic Wave, and Cyclic managed to verify it at a very short time, but without video evidence. This is because, at the time, the need to show a verification video or stream wasn't necessary. But after many impossible levels were being released, the community and RobTop himself declared that players had to have footage of their major completions. So with that, Sonic Wave was unrated. And when Cyclic heard the news about this, he wanted to double down on everyone. So, out of desperation, he heavily buffed Sonic Wave, which was much harder than Bloodbath, and he verified it once again. This time, it was rated since he gave video proof, and on August 12th of 2015, Riot verified Bloodbath after months of dedication. After that happened, people started getting suspicious of Cyclic, as there was no way anyone could beat a level that difficult so quickly. And on March 4th of 2016, Cyclic confessed to hacking his completions, and seemingly left the community. At this point, Riot was on top for the meantime, and it would stay that way for a very long time. Now, let's move on to the next year. 2016 was a relatively quiet year for the community, as it took a very long time for a level to dethrone Bloodbath. But over time, we had a few players that completed Bloodbath, such as Quasar, Serves, and Souls TRK. And on August 14th, Trusta would verify a once impossible level, Sakupin Hell. The level was said to be harder than Bloodbath, and mostly everyone agreed. And not long after, another level was verified, Athanatos, which was hacked by Aurorus. But as these two levels were surfacing in popularity, the difficulty was questioned if these levels were actually harder than Bloodbath itself, because at the time, we were in the 1.9 update, when the wave game mode was somewhat new and harder to control than modern GD physics. So eventually, these two levels were pushed down in difficulty, as Bloodbath still remained on top. And on November 25th, Sonix would be the first to legitimately verify Sonic Wave after so long. And I know this sounds like the completion of hard levels determined who was the top player, but that was going to change only 2 months later. 2017 was a very eventful year for top players, as that title was constantly shifted, especially with the Demon List being released on January 17th of that year. which will be crucial way later. But with the release of the Demon List, the community had access to a somewhat reliable source of measurement when it comes to the difficulty amongst the hardest levels. The hardest level on the list when it was first launched was Artificial Ascent, which was actually verified on December 11th of 2016. But that title did not last long, as it took a few weeks for Sonic Wave to be on the list. But at the same moment, Trusta would verify one of the hardest and most famous levels in Geometry Dash history, Yatagarasu.
Yeah! Yes!
And many people were clashing on which level was more difficult, but eventually people came to their senses and realized Sonic Wave was much harder. At this point, Combined, Sonix, and Trusta were the main contenders as the best players during early 2017. But on March 19th, Boltstep would verify Erebus.
Oh my god, I just verified Erebus! Oh my god!
But there was an issue. Erebus had a similar situation with Yatagarasu, because there were many debates if it was harder than Sonic Wave. And again, it ended up with Sonic Wave dethroning Erebus. But while Sonic still remained on top as the best player, another person would soon replace Sonix. Throughout that year, there was a player that was completing many levels in general, including some of the hardest of all time. They were the #1 player in the world on the game's leaderboards, and were praised for their skill. The player's name was Noctafly. He'd complete levels such as Black Blizzard and Artificial Ascent, and would actually be the verifier of a level titled Zafkiel. But as his reign on top was unjustifiable, his downfall would occur with the release of one video. Riot would upload a video exposing Noctafly for splicing and having semi-automatic gameplay. Noctafly would end up leaving the community immediately after the exposal. This ended up with Sonix being the top player in Geometry Dash. And for the rest of 2017, nothing much would happen, till history would be made. 2018 was a historic year for the community, but also one of the quietest. This is because there was a level that was verified, but was also a no-brainer on who was the best Geometry Dash player, because on February 20th, Nobbleboy would make his name known as the best player when he verified the legendary level Bloodlust. And while it is very obvious on how hard Bloodlust really is, back then, people annoyingly again debated on its difficulty. But we are not getting into that, as unsurprisingly, it ended up with Bloodlust dethroning Plasma Pulse Finale, and it would stay that way for the rest of the year. But even though Nobbleboy verified Bloodlust, it was one of those rare cases where it didn't make him a top player, as Sonix was still on top at this point. But there was someone alongside him that was showing amazing skill, Wooshi999. Known for verifying the second hardest level, Crimson Planet, Wooshi completed many of the hardest levels at the time, such as Plasma Pulse Finale and Gamma. Wooshi was also nominated as the best player in the GD 2.1 awards, but he eventually started playing the game less over time, and lost his top player status. But there's another player that I feel was super underrated for his time, and still is to this day, Diamond Splash. He was known for verifying Spatial Rend, which was the hardest level at the time, before Crimson Planet. His legacy was similar to Noctafly's, but he beat and verified many of the hardest levels legitimately, and maintained that consistency to this day by recently completing Limbo. So by the end of 2018, we had Sonix and Wooshi as our main top players, and we can now move on to the next year. 2019 was a completely different year for top players, as this was when top players would start to become a thing for the community. But who were the top players of this year? Well, there were actually 4 notable players: Technical, Nepesta, Xander556, and Dolphy. But we will talk about him later. But to kick off this new year, on January 29th, Xander would verify the new hardest demon of that year, Zodiac. The issue about this completion was that the verification had no clicks, and there were no progression videos. Instead, there were uploaded progression posts. While it is suspicious, people went along with it. The community only wanted a verification video, but after a few months, Xander would confess to hacking Zodiac. Everyone was surprised, and eventually the community came to the conclusion that clicks were essential for progression and verification videos. But while Zodiac should have been removed from the demon list, it resulted with it staying as number 1, as Technical was the first victor/verifier of that level. But throughout the end of 2018 to the entirety of 2019, Technical was by far the best top player, as he had completed Zodiac, Ragnarok, and Bloodlust. He was also the number 1 player in the demon list for a while, but that would soon change at the end of 2019, when Dolphy and another player named Nswish would make their presence known, as they are going to make history in the following year. 2020 was one of the quietest years for the demon list, but very active when it came to the top player status. The top players of this year consist of 3 people: Swyborg, Rory, and Nswish, but we'll get to those in just a bit, as on January 6th, Dolphy would verify one of Riot's biggest projects, and by far the hardest level at that point, Tartarus, which would remain as the hardest level for around 1.5 years. And while Dolphy was one of the best players at the time, he didn't have much of a top player status, as he focused on easier demons and becoming a content creator. It was mainly these 3 that really rose to the top. Let's start off with Swyborg. Swyborg became known for his major completions such as Cold Sweat and the Golden, which was the second hardest level at the time. He would remain consistent on his completions in the following months. He was also one of the highest ranked players on the demon list. Rory's legacy was similar to Swyborg's, as his main completions were Renevant, the Golden, and Tartarus. He definitely had the skill, and maybe just a bit more. However, these 2 players were outclassed by Nswish, by far the best Geometry Dash player and top player this game has ever seen, as on September 9th, Nswish was the first player in GD history to beat the entire main list, and had by far the most list points out of anybody. It wasn't even a competition for Nswish to win the 2020 GD awards either. He was just that good. So there isn't really much else to say, but let's move on to the next year. 2021 was the spark for players to reach the top, a few players of which we know of today, but there were many top players that arose when the Slaughterhouse race began. The verifiers were Zamasu, Zanny, Trick, Photonic, Doggy, and SpaceUK. Oh boy, let's just get this over with. SpaceUK hacked. Doggy verified it. That is all I'll mention. Anyways, when Doggy verified Slaughterhouse, it remained on top for a very long time. But top player wise, SpaceUK's legacy before he was exposed was similar to Nswish's. He was able to beat the entire main list on the demon list, and was the highest ranked player on the stats viewer page. No one could outmatch him throughout that year. The main people who were as close to Space's rank were RG and Crisis, but sadly, SpaceUK was just too good, as when Slaughterhouse was verified, it inspired many new players to tag along and make their way up to the ranks. But now, let's explore the next year. 2022 was the biggest rise in Geometry Dash top player history. As though SpaceUK would still remain on top, many new players were rising closer and closer to SpaceUK's status, such as Wolves, Cursed, Thunder, and Zoink. Most of us know who these people are today, but the main contenders were Snowballer, Trick, and Zoink. For a very short time, Wolves was the #1 player in the world, as SpaceUK's profile was removed for unknown reasons, but his account was brought back shortly after. So no harm, right? Yeah, just wait till later. Anyways, Zoink was starting to rise as a top player, and slowly making his way up to dethrone Space. In the meantime, Zoink was also one of the best players in the community, as he not only did what Nswish and Space have achieved by beating the entire main list, but he also verified the hardest level in the game. Acheron.
I verified Acheron! I verified Acheron!
But yeah, there isn't really much else to say since Zoink was well beyond everyone on the ranks. But it wasn't enough to surpass SpaceUK. Until now. 2023 was quiet when it came to the top players, except for one key element, when Zoink had surpassed SpaceUK as the #1 player in the world. But it was also quiet for the top 10 hardest levels, as the only changes that happened were Cosmos, Codependence, and Kyoki being added on the top 10, and Avernus being added as the hardest level. Normally, levels would be absolutely shifted in the span of a year, but not much happened really. Some new top players would consist of Skysoul, Tiago, and W Popoff. The best player of that year would also be Zoink, as he was titled the best Geometry Dash player in the 2023 GD Awards. This was also the same year that SpaceUK was exposed for cheating, and was exiled away from the community. We aren't getting into that though, as we all know what he did. Anyways, with Zoink being the top and best player, we move on to the most recent year. 2024 is still ongoing to this day, but there was some recent activity between 3 players, W Popoff, Zoink, and Trick. Here's when things became interesting. Zoink was able to verify the hardest level to date, Tidal Wave, and Trick and W Popoff are currently the only people to ever beat it, depending if Tiago beats it before this is uploaded. This means that Zoink had verified the top 3 hardest levels, but we need to talk about W Popoff, who many claim to be the best player in Geometry Dash as of right now. He may have not surpassed Zoink, but he definitely has the skill to do it. And Trick, who very recently had surpassed Zoink as the top player after so long. Currently, Trick remains as the #1 player, and it is very debated whether which of these 3 players rather have the most skill or experience in Geometry Dash. But who knows? Maybe we will see Zoink or W Popoff come on top, or a very new and underrated player. We will just have to see. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and big shout out to Root Beer Floats as Pop, as this was inspired by his top players video, and I apologize if I missed any information or if anything is incorrect. Thank you all for watching, and Nordihydrocapsaicin.